Hello and welcome to Audiobook Reviews. In this video, I'll be discussing Forging the Darksword, the first book in the Darksword Trilogy by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Forging the Darksword opens up to a completely magical world. It sets the scene for a land that those who could use magic fled to, quite possibly from our world, because they were facing persecution and burning at the stake. In the lands of Thimholland, magic is literally life. It is the life force of every living creature. Everyone has magic to varying degrees, and a very medieval hierarchy is established with your emperors, your royalty, peasants, and of course, the church plays a really big role as well. The really interesting caveat to a world where everyone, to an extent, can use magic is the idea of catalysts. Catalysts are people born with the ability to absorb magic from the world and then give it to those who can actually use it. So a catalyst can't use magic on their own, but magic users only have so much of their own life force they can use before they need a catalyst to grant them life or magic. It creates a really interesting relationship between the two groups, the catalysts being, for example, the only people who actually have to walk and not float is a big piece, but the catalysts belong to the church, and the more powerful magic users, wizards, etc., typically belong to the royalty. The big question that really kicks off the narrative, though, is in a world where magic is life force, everyone has magic, well, what happens if someone is born without? Especially when an ancient prophecy warns that potentially the world may end when this event takes place. First, we meet Sarian, a young priest who's part of the testing for the long-awaited child of the Empress and the Emperor, but that child is deemed to be dead. As the rites are performed before all for this dead baby, that is, I'll note, very much alive, just without magic, Sarian's really impacted heavily, and that's one of the first pieces that affects his character in a big way. And though the world believes the child to be dead, Joram, as he's named, actually does survive, and he's spirited away to grow up in a small border town, learning the harsh ways of the world there, with his presumably adopted mother. They both end up in a settlement of the dark sorcerers who follow the most dark art, technology, not proper magic, and they get wrapped up in the forging of the Darksword, which is a powerful weapon that can drain magic, essentially, and acts as kind of a reverse. And what impact will that discovery have on the world? Now, to me, this was a very interesting premise, and I was sold on it pretty early on. For a book written over 30 years ago, Weis and Hickman did a great job of using some tropes for familiarity, but using them to craft an entirely new world and unique story. The world building and lore established is fantastic, from the subtle clues like the capital being named Marilon after the founder, to the setup of the Iron Wars between the technologists and the other magic users, which is what made a world where technology is dark and forbidden be the commonplace. But when everyone can use magic, why would you need technology? Sets up a lot of interesting scenes where those who are used to having magic for everything see just really basic things and just are dumbfounded by their existence. But the first problem for me actually does come in the world building, though, as well, and it's something I noticed in some of the characterization as well. To me, it seems like you can really feel the two different authors in this story, which isn't something I've noticed in their other work like Dragonlance. There'll be a passage where we get a page-long exposition dump explaining something, but then something else will be explained very subtly in an understated way, which makes it even more powerful when it's revealed in full. And there was one character in particular that I really noticed kind of the dichotomy between the descriptions. They were set up to be extremely imposing and dangerous. They barely even speak because silence causes more fear. But then in other passages, they chat, play cards, drink, and just kind of are there, and they're still supposed to be imposing, but it's a very different descriptor. And then after a scene like that, you typically get like a little note, almost like it was trying to recover the mystique of the character and say, cards was the one thing this character does that's normal. Discussing characters, though, that is by far the weakest part of this book. We get a cast of characters that have mostly only one-dimensional traits. For example, Mosiah is a good friend with a conscience. Sibkin is annoying, but secretly knows more than he lets on. Bishop Vanya is kind of the classic shade of grey priest, and even our main characters don't seem to get a lot extra. We're given what could be a really interesting main character with Joram having to deal with being without magic in a magical world, and while we get some pieces to give him depth, like him also being manic depressive, a lot of his characterization falls pretty flat. He's a moody child, then brooding teenager who's bitter and wants what's his, and not exactly a lot of originality coming out of that. Sarion, we get a little bit more depth to an extent, because we get to see his journey a little bit more through his faith over the years. He's a priest, but he really desires knowledge more than anything. He's a mathematical genius, and that's really what he cares about. And even one of the big events is he gets in trouble for specifically trying to read forbidden texts because he just wants knowledge that much. And he begins to question his faith more and more as he actually really sees the state of the world for the first time. But for me, Sarion was the more interesting character to read than Joram, even though I think Joram is being set up as more of the main character, but it may not be the case. Sarion, I think, did actually have more screen time here, and there's definitely a lot that's most likely going to be coming in the later books. So I ended up being a bit torn on this book overall. The premise is very interesting and unique, while also embodying that classical fantasy feel. As an aside, this is actually one of the things I love about Weis and Hickman. They are great about using something familiar and turning it on its head to give you something new. But there are some serious issues with the lack of characterization and the sometimes clumsy passages with world building and also with characterization. The big thing to keep in mind, though, is that Forging the Darksword is book 1 of the Darksword Trilogy, so there's a lot of room within the next 2 books for improvement, and I'm really hoping to see some of that improvement as I get into the next books. Book 1 did lay a lot of groundwork for the world and overall plot, and really did feel more like it was just a stepping stone versus a complete story, so I think there's going to be hopefully a lot more action, a lot more actually going on after book 1 has gotten where it needed to be. When it comes down to it, I did enjoy this book, and I think it's a good book. There were definitely some pain points, as I've noted, but the premise is what kept me interested enough to keep going, and the next book I think will really be the deciding factor. If it continues to improve and build upon everything that started in book 1, I think I'll really enjoy it. If it's kind of in the same way, I think that's going to definitely be a negative point for it. But if you like fantasy with a very classic feel with a twist, this is something you will very likely enjoy. If you've read other Weis and Hickman as well, their kind of writing style, if you enjoy that, you'll probably enjoy this as well. And I think, honestly, there's enough good here to make it very much worth the read despite its flaws, and I'll have to just wait and see if my opinion changes after book 2 to either upgrade or downgrade from there. That said, that's my review for Forging the Dark Sword, book 1 of the Darksword Trilogy. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to give it a like, and if you'd like to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe.